The evening air felt heavy with humidity as Dr. Andre Wilson pulled her silver Honda Accord onto Maple Street. Her shoulders ached after a grueling 12-hour shift at Children's Memorial Hospital, where she'd spent most of the day treating young patients with various ailments. All she could think about was getting home to a warm shower and the leftovers her husband had promised to save from dinner. The streetlights cast long shadows across her path as she carefully maintained the speed limit, knowing all too well about the increased police presence in this suburban Atlanta neighborhood. She'd heard stories from other black professionals in the area about unnecessary stops, but she'd always tried to stay optimistic about her community. The flash of blue lights in her rearview mirror shattered her peaceful drive home. Andre checked her speedometer, 35 in a 35 zone. Her heart rate quickened, but she remained calm, recalling the conversation she'd had with her husband about exactly this situation. Following protocol, she turned on her interior lights, placed both hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over to a well-lit area near a convenience store. Through her side mirror, she watched Officer Richard Brooks approach, his hand resting unnecessarily on his holstered weapon. Something about his stance made her uneasy. She could see a couple of store customers watching from the parking lot, their presence offering a small measure of comfort. License and registration, Brooks barked before he'd even reached her window. His flashlight beam hit her eyes with unnecessary intensity. "Good evening, officer," Andrea replied steadily, her voice clear and professional. "My credentials are in my glove compartment, and my registration is in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's okay." "Just hurry up," he snapped, his tone dripping with contempt. As she carefully reached for her documents, her hospital ID badge caught the flashlight's beam. "I'm just coming home from my shift at Children's Memorial," she explained, hoping to establish a human connection. "I'm a pediatrician there." "Yeah, right," Brooks scoffed, snatching her license. "And I'm the Surgeon General. Step out of the vehicle." Andrea's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, pressing the record button as her husband had advised. "May I ask why I'm being asked to exit the vehicle, officer? I haven't violated any traffic laws." "Oh, so now you're refusing to comply?" Brooks's voice rose sharply. "Typical. You people always think you know better than law enforcement." The slur wasn't spoken, but it hung in the air between them. Andrea kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm not refusing, officer. I'm simply asking for clarification, which is my right as a citizen. Could you please explain why I'm being detained?" Brooks's face contorted with anger. "Your taillight's out," he spat, though Andrea knew this wasn't true. She'd just had her car serviced last week. More people had gathered at the convenience store now, phones raised. Andrea felt simultaneously safer and more anxious about the growing audience. She knew this moment could either diffuse or explode, and much of it depended on her next actions. "Sir," she said calmly, making sure her phone was still recording, "I understand you're doing your job. I respect that. But I want to be clear that I'm complying while also exercising my rights as a citizen. I'm going to step out slowly, but I'd like to continue recording this interaction for both of our safety." Brooks's hand tightened on his weapon. "Recording me? That's interfering with police business. Out of the car now." Andrea could see one of the store customers dialing a number, hopefully 911. She thought of her husband at the FBI office, probably wrapping up his day's work, unaware that his worst fears about her safety were unfolding. Taking a deep breath, she began to slowly open her car door, maintaining her composure even as her professional life and personal safety hung precariously in the balance. The cool night air hit her face as she emerged from the car, still gripping her phone. Her white doctor's coat seemed to glow under the streetlights, a stark reminder of the identity that Officer Brooks had so quickly dismissed. She stood tall, dignified, knowing that her every move was being recorded not just by her phone, but by the growing crowd of witnesses. This wasn't just about her anymore. This moment would ripple out, touching lives far beyond this street corner. Andrea thought of her young patients, of their parents who trusted her with their children's lives, and she knew she had to handle this situation in a way that would make them proud. She was a healer, a professional, a black woman in America, and right now she needed to be stronger than her fear. The tension in the air thickened as Dr. Andre Wilson stood beside her car, phone steady in her hand. Officer Brooks's face twisted with barely contained anger at the sight of her recording device. The convenience store's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the scene, while more bystanders gathered at a cautious distance. "I said turn that phone off," Brooks growled, stepping closer. His hand still hadn't left his weapon, a detail that didn't escape the watching crowd's attention. Several more phones were raised now, capturing the escalating situation from different angles. "Officer, I'm maintaining my legal right to record this interaction," Andrea stated calmly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm complying with all your instructions while doing so." Brooks's response came in the form of quick, aggressive movement. Before Andrea could react, he grabbed her wrist, twisting until her phone clattered to the ground. The sudden pain made her gasp, but she bit back any other sound, knowing that her reaction could mean the difference between going home or going to jail. "Hands behind your back," Brooks barked, roughly spinning her around. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into her wrists as he tightened them several notches too tight. Her medical training told her that the tingling in her fingers wasn't a good sign. From the growing crowd came voices of protest. "She didn't do anything wrong," someone shouted. "We're recording everything," called another. Andrea could hear the fury in their voices, matching the rage she felt building inside herself. But years of dealing with emergency room situations had taught her the value of staying composed under pressure. "Officer Brooks," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the pain shooting through her wrists, "you're hurting me. The cuffs are too tight, and as a doctor, I can tell you you're cutting off my circulation." "Oh, now you're resisting arrest and giving medical advice." Brooks sneered, giving her arm an unnecessary twist that sent fresh pain shooting through her shoulder. "You can add that to the charges." A young woman stepped forward from the crowd, her phone live-streaming the scene. "What charges? We all saw everything." She was following the law. Brooks's head snapped toward the crowd. "Stay back, or you'll all be arrested for interfering with police business." Andrea felt herself being roughly pushed toward the patrol car, her white doctor's coat now smudged with dirt from where Brooks had shoved her against the vehicle. Her mind raced through protocol: stay calm, remember details, don't resist. The same advice she'd given to so many others now played like a mantra in her head. Through the patrol car's window, she could see her own phone still recording on the ground, its screen cracked but the red light still blinking. Her hospital ID had fallen next to it, the children's memorial logo clearly visible under the streetlight. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just hours ago, she'd been saving lives in the pediatric ward, and now she was being treated like a criminal for driving home from work. The crowd had swelled to nearly 20 people now, their voices rising in unified protest. Someone mentioned calling the police chief, another shouted about contacting the local news. Andrea caught fragments of their conversations as Brooks roughly patted her down, his actions deliberately humiliating. "I need to inform you," Andrea said clearly, making sure the nearby phones could pick up her voice, "that I have a shoulder injury from a previous surgery. The way you're handling me risks medical harm." It was a lie. She had no such injury, but she knew documenting her clear communication would matter later. "Should have thought about that before you decided to resist," Brooks snapped, though his grip loosened slightly, aware of the many cameras focused on him. Inside, Andrea's mind was already several steps ahead. She knew her husband would be notified soon, if he hadn't been already. As an FBI agent specializing in civil rights violations, he would know exactly how to handle this situation. But right now, she had to focus on surviving it. A police supervisor's car pulled up, lights flashing. Andrea felt a glimmer of hope, quickly tempered by experience. She'd heard too many stories about the thin blue line, about supervisors who backed their officers regardless of circumstances. Still, this was one more witness, one more official record of what was happening. The night air had grown colder, or maybe it was just shock setting in. Andrea watched her breath form small clouds in the air as she waited, standing as dignified as possible despite the handcuffs. Her white coat, a symbol of her dedication to helping others, now served as a stark contrast to how she was being treated. She thought about her patients, about the trust they placed in her, and stood taller. Tomorrow, this would be a different kind of battle, one fought with lawyers and evidence rather than restraint and patience. But for now, she had to endure. Special Agent David Wilson was reviewing case files in his FBI office when his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end belonged to a convenience store worker, speaking quickly about a black female doctor being harassed by a police officer outside their store. His hand froze over the case files he'd been studying. Is her name Andre Wilson? The answer made his blood run cold. He was already grabbing his keys before the caller finished explaining. Sir, you should know, there's video. What's of it? The officer, he's not being professional. The caller's hesitation said more than their words. David's training kicked in, pushing down the rage threatening to overwhelm him. Keep recording, he instructed, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Tell others to record too. I'm on my way. He ended the call and immediately dialed his supervisor. The fluorescent lights of the FBI office buzzed overhead as he quickly briefed Assistant Director Reynolds. Sir, we've got a situation. Local officer, possible civil rights violation in progress. The victim is, he paused, maintaining his professional tone. The victim is my wife. Reynolds' response was immediate. Take Thompson and Rivera with you. Document everything. Keep your distance unless she's in immediate danger. We'll handle this by the book. David's colleagues noticed the change in him as he strode through the office. His usual easy smile was gone, replaced by the focused intensity they typically only saw during major operations. Agent Thompson looked up from her desk, caught his eye, and immediately grabbed her jacket. Rivera was already heading for the door, car keys in hand. In the elevator, David pulled up his phone, accessing the police department's database. Officer Richard Brooks, badge number 6847. 15 complaints in 8 years, all quietly buried. Multiple allegations of excessive force, particularly against minorities. David's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the records. We've been building a case against that precinct, Thompson said quietly, watching him read. Multiple incidents, similar pattern. Just didn't have anything solid enough yet. The drive felt endless, even with the lights and sirens clearing their path. David's mind raced through protocols and procedures, forcing himself to think like an agent rather than a husband. He'd seen cases like this before, too many of them. But this time, the victim wasn't just another file on his desk. He thought about that morning, kissing Andre goodbye as she left for her hospital shift. They joked about her terrible coffee, planned weekend dinner with friends. Now she was living the exact scenario they'd discussed so many times: what to do when pulled over, how to stay safe, when to record. Rivera broke into his thoughts, social media's lighting up. Multiple live streams from the scene. Local news is picking it up. She held up her tablet, showing various angles of the incident. David forced himself to watch, his trained eye noting every detail that would later become evidence. Her phone was recording, Thompson observed, zooming in on one video. It's still on the ground there. That's chain of custody for any audio she captured. David nodded, his mind already building the case. 8 years investigating civil rights violations had taught him patience, taught him how to transform anger into action. He'd seen too many cases fall apart because someone acted on emotion rather than evidence. The lights of the convenience store came into view as they turned onto Maple Street. David could see the crowd first, then the police cars, their blue lights painting everything in surreal colors. Andrea stood handcuffed beside a patrol car, her white doctor's coat visible even from a distance. His heart clenched, but his face remained impassive. By the book, he reminded himself and his colleagues as they pulled up. Everything by the book. The crowd parted as they approached, FBI badges visible. David caught Andrea's eye briefly, saw her almost imperceptible nod. They'd discussed this too, how to handle it if their professional lives ever intersected like this. She would play her part, and he would play his. Together, they would show Officer Brooks and his entire department what justice really looked like. Thompson was already coordinating with witnesses, collecting contact information. Rivera had begun documenting the scene, her camera clicking steadily. David straightened his tie, adjusted his badge, and prepared to introduce himself to Officer Brooks, not as an angry husband, but as a federal agent about to open an investigation that would shake an entire police department to its core. The FBI field office buzzed with focused energy as Special Agent David Wilson and his team began unraveling the threads of Officer Brooks's history. The wall of their dedicated task force room slowly filled with photos, documents, and connection maps, each piece telling part of a larger story. "Look at this," Agent Thompson said, pointing to her computer screen. Brooks had 3 excessive force complaints in the last year alone. All of them mysteriously disappeared from official records. She pulled up scanned copies of the original complaint forms obtained from a sympathetic clerk at the police department. David leaned closer, studying the documents. His wife's incident had opened a door, and behind it lay years of buried injustice. "Cross-reference these with hospital records," he instructed. "If these victims sought medical attention, we'll find a paper trail they couldn't bury." The team worked methodically, their investigation expanding like ripples in a pond. One victim led to another, each story adding weight to their case. Local news coverage of Andrea's arrest had sparked something in the community. People were finally coming forward, tired of staying silent. And young intern rushed in, clutching printouts. "Sir, we found something in the department's internal communications." She spread the papers across the conference table. Every time a complaint was filed against Brooks, there's an email chain between the captain and internal affairs. They used code words, but it's pretty clear they were coordinating cover-ups. David nodded, keeping his expression neutral despite the anger simmering beneath. "Good work. Get tech to recover any deleted emails from that chain, and find out who else was copied on these messages." The investigation ran deep into the night. Pizza boxes piled up as the team pored over body camera footage, dispatch records, and witness statements. They discovered a pattern. Brooks wasn't just a lone bad officer. He was part of a system that protected its own at the expense of justice. "Look at this timestamp," Rivera pointed out, comparing 2 videos. Brooks's body cam conveniently malfunctioned during the Thompson incident last month, but we've got civilian footage showing him using excessive force. She played the clips side by side, the evidence standing. The wall of evidence grew larger each day. Photos of bruised civilians, transcripts of ignored complaints, internal memos showing deliberate negligence. But it wasn't just about collecting evidence, it was about building a case that would stand up in federal court. Late one evening, as David reviewed witness statements, a custodian paused in the doorway. "Agent Wilson," she said softly, "I saw what happened to your wife on the news. My brother, the same officer, did something similar to him last year. He was too scared to file a complaint." David looked up, his exhaustion forgotten. "Would your brother be willing to make a statement now?" The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. Another piece of the puzzle, another voice ready to speak truth to power. The investigation expanded beyond Brooks. Each layer they peeled back revealed more rot within the department. Officers who had witnessed misconduct but stayed silent. Supervisors who dismissed valid complaints. A police union that worked harder to protect bad officers than serve the public trust. Andrea's case had become a catalyst, but the investigation was now much bigger than one incident. It was about bringing light to years of systematic abuse and cover-ups. David and his team worked meticulously, knowing that every detail mattered, every testimony needed to be bulletproof. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired police sergeant, haunted by years of witnessing misconduct, finally decided to speak up. His testimony provided the inside perspective they needed, confirming the deliberate pattern of discrimination and cover-ups. In the task force room, David stood before the evidence wall, seeing not just documents and photos, but the human stories behind each piece. He thought of Andrea, of the custodian's brother, of countless others who had suffered in silence. The case was building, growing stronger each day, but he knew the real challenge still lay ahead. "We're not just building a case," he told his team during their daily briefing. "We're building a chance for change. Every person who came forward, every piece of evidence we uncover, it all matters. This isn't just about one officer or one incident anymore. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else." The team nodded, understanding the weight of their work. They weren't just investigating a crime, they were dismantling a system that had protected wrongdoing for far too long. and as they dug deeper, they knew there was no turning back. The morning sun streamed through the local news station's windows as the police chief shifted uncomfortably in front of the cameras. The reporters' questions were relentless, each one backed by evidence from the FBI investigation that had been leaked to the press. "Chief, how do you explain these internal emails showing systematic suppression of civilian complaints against Officer Brooks and others?" The reporter held up printouts, their damning contents now public knowledge. Behind the scenes, David Wilson watched the press conference on a monitor in his office, his team gathered around. The investigation had broken wide open when a young officer, tired of carrying the weight of silence, came forward with a hard drive full of deleted body camera footage. "Play the footage again," David instructed Agent Thompson. The screen showed multiple incidents. Traffic stops turned violent, unnecessary force, racial slurs caught on hot mix. Each video had supposedly been lost or corrupted, according to department records. The police union's attempts to control the narrative crumbled as more evidence emerged. Local business owners provided security camera footage. Hospital records showed a pattern of injuries consistent with excessive force. The department's own dispatch logs contradicted official reports. A knock on the office door interrupted their review. "Agent Wilson? There's someone here you need to meet." A middle-aged man in a maintenance uniform stood in the doorway, his hands clutching his work hat. "I was a janitor at the precinct for 15 years, he began. "I saw things, heard things. They didn't think I was paying attention, but I was." His testimony opened new doors. He described late-night meetings where officers discussed handling problem complaints. He remembered shredded documents, overheard conversations, dates and times that matched perfectly with their existing evidence. The local media couldn't get enough of the story. Police Department ex-POCD. Years of cover-ups revealed ran across headlines. Social media exploded with previously silent victims sharing their stories. The hashtag police accountability trended as the community finally found its voice. In the police department, the walls were crumbling. Officers began turning on each other, each trying to save themselves. The chief's secretary came forward with recordings of phone calls. The IT department produced mysteriously deleted emails. The thin blue line was breaking under the weight of truth. David's team worked around the clock, processing each new piece of evidence. They uncovered a points system officers used to cover for each other's misconduct. They found unofficial quotas targeting specific neighborhoods. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The afternoon news brought footage of Officer Brooks being escorted from the precinct, head down, no longer so confident. Behind him, internal affairs investigators carried boxes of evidence. His supervisor was next, then the captain who had helped bury the complaints. In the hospital cafeteria, Dr. Andre Wilson watched the coverage during her lunch break. Her colleagues gathered around, many sharing their own stories of encounters with the department. The fear that had kept people silent for so long was finally breaking. Back at the FBI office, David stood before the evidence wall, now expanded to 3 times its original size. Photos, documents, testimonies, each piece represented someone who had suffered in silence. But now their voices were being heard. "We've got them," Agent Rivera said quietly, adding another transcript to the wall. "They can't hide anymore." The investigation had exposed more than just corrupt officers. It revealed a culture of silence, a system designed to protect itself rather than serve the public. But as the evidence mounted and more people came forward, something else emerged: hope. Community leaders organized peaceful rallies supporting the investigation. Other police departments reached out, eager to demonstrate their commitment to transparency. Reform proposals that had gathered dust for years suddenly found new life. As the sun set over the city, David knew this was just the beginning. The exposure of corruption was one thing, creating lasting change would be another. But looking at the wall of evidence, hearing the voices of those finally speaking out, he felt the momentum of truth building. Sometimes it took one moment, one incident, to crack open years of silence. And through that crack, justice could finally begin to flow. The federal courthouse stood tall against the morning sky as Dr. Andre Wilson climbed the steps, her husband David by her side. Inside, the hallways buzzed with tension as lawyers, witnesses, and journalists gathered for what would become a landmark police accountability case. The prosecution's table was ready, stacked with evidence boxes containing thousands of documents, videos, and testimonies. U.S. Attorney Patricia Chen adjusted her glasses, reviewing her opening statement one final time. This case wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong, it was about years of systematic abuse of power. All rise. The bailiff's voice rang out as Judge Henderson entered the courtroom. The air felt electric as cameras clicked and reporters scribbled. This was the moment when all their evidence would finally see the light of day. Andrea sat in the witness stand, her voice steady as she recounted that night. "I had just finished a 12-hour shift treating sick children," she testified. "I was wearing my doctor's coat, my hospital ID was visible, and I followed every procedure correctly." The jury listened intently as she described Brooks's aggressive behavior, his dismissal of her professional status, the unnecessary force. The defense tried to paint Brooks as a dedicated officer in a dangerous job, but the evidence told a different story. Video after video played in court, showing a pattern of behavior that couldn't be explained away. Former officers testified about the department's unwritten rules, about how complaints disappeared, about the pressure to protect their own at any cost. The system wasn't broken, U.S. Attorney Chen argued, pacing before the jury. It was working exactly as designed, to protect those who abused their power while silencing their victims. Today, we have a chance to change that system. During a break, David found Andrea in the courthouse corridor. "You did great up there," he said softly, resisting the urge to hold her hand. They had to maintain professional distance during the trial. She nodded, both of them knowing this was bigger than their personal story. The defense's case began to unravel as more witnesses came forward. A former internal affairs investigator admitted to burying complaints under pressure from superiors. The department's own records showed Brooks had been promoted despite numerous red flags. Each testimony added another crack to the wall of silence. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecution played the full video from Andrew's phone the night of her arrest. The footage was damning. Brooks's aggressive behavior, his dismissal of her professional status, the unnecessary force used during the arrest. But it was his casual racism, caught clearly on audio, that made several jurors visibly flinch. "The badge is not a shield for bigotry," Chen told the jury in her closing argument. "It's not a license to abuse power. When we give officers authority, we trust them to use it justly." Officer Brooks and his superiors betrayed that trust systematically and repeatedly. The defense's closing seemed weak in comparison. They spoke of split-second decisions, of dangerous streets, of supporting law enforcement. But the evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear to ignore. As the jury began deliberations, the courthouse steps became a gathering place for the community. People shared stories of their own encounters with police, of times they'd been afraid to speak up. Local organizations set up information booths about knowing your rights. What had started as one incident had grown into a movement. Inside, Andre and David waited with the rest of the team. They'd built the strongest case possible, exposed years of corruption, given voice to countless victims. Now it was in the jury's hands. The waiting was the hardest part. Each hour felt like a day. Legal experts on TV debated the case's implications. Other police departments watched closely, knowing this verdict could set new precedents for accountability. Civil rights organizations prepared statements, ready for either outcome. Through it all, Andre and David remained focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't about revenge, it was about change. They'd followed every procedure, gathered every piece of evidence, built an airtight case. Now they waited for justice to run its course, hoping their efforts would help ensure no one else would have to endure what Andre had experienced that night. The jury returned after 2 days of deliberation. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Henderson asked for their decision. Officer Brooks stood rigid at the defense table, his arrogance finally replaced by fear. Dr. Andre Wilson and Agent David Wilson sat composed, their hands clasped tightly under the table. "We find the defendant guilty." The words echoed through the courtroom. Not just Brooks, but 3 senior officers who had helped cover up his actions, all found guilty of civil rights violations. The judge's gavel fell, marking the end of years of unchecked abuse of power. Outside the courthouse, the community erupted in celebration. People hugged and cried, many sharing their own stories of encounters with Brooks and others like him. Local news cameras captured the moment as Andre stepped up to the microphones. "Today isn't about victory," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's about accountability. No one is above the law, especially those sworn to uphold it. This case proves that when we stand together and speak truth to power, justice is possible." The sentencing came 3 weeks later. Brooks received 8 years in federal prison. His supervisors got shorter terms, but their careers in law enforcement were finished. The police department faced a complete overhaul under federal oversight. But the real changes came in the months that followed. The department implemented new training programs focused on community relations and bias awareness. Body cameras became mandatory, with strict penalties for tampering. A civilian oversight board was established, giving the community a real voice in police accountability. David's promotion to head a new civil rights task force came with a broader mission. His team began working with other departments across the state, helping them identify and address similar issues before they escalated. The lessons from Brooks's case became a blueprint for reform. Andrea found herself speaking at police academies, sharing her story with new recruits. "Your badge is a symbol of public trust," she would tell them. "Every interaction you have can either build or break that trust. Choose wisely." Her words carried extra weight coming from someone who had experienced abuse of power firsthand. The convenience store where it all began became an unofficial community center. People gathered there to share information about their rights, to support each other, to build bridges between law enforcement and the community. The owner hung a plaque commemorating the night when one woman's courage sparked a movement for change. 6 months after the verdict, Andrea and David hosted a community dinner in their backyard. Officers from the reformed department sat alongside local activists and community leaders. Children played while adults discussed continued improvements in police-community relations. The fear and tension that had once divided them was slowly being replaced by understanding and respect. Late that evening, as the last guests left, Andrea found a quiet moment with David on their porch. "Remember when you told me to always record police interactions?" she asked, thinking back to their conversations before that fateful night. He nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I just wanted to keep you safe. I never imagined we'd end up changing an entire system." "We didn't do it alone," she reminded him. "It took everyone. The witnesses who recorded that night, the officers who finally spoke up, the community that refused to stay silent. That's the real victory here." Inside their home, a frame held the front page from the day of the verdict. But next to it hung something more important, a letter from a young black girl who wanted to become both a doctor and an FBI agent, inspired by their story. It was just one of hundreds they'd received, each representing a person who now believed that justice was possible. The city had changed. Not overnight, and not without continued effort, but it had changed. Where there had once been fear and distrust, there was now hope and accountability. Andrea and David's case had shown that the system could work when people stood together for what was right. As stars appeared in the evening sky, they could hear laughter from neighboring houses, children playing without fear, a community healing. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And sometimes that's where justice begins, with one person willing to stand up, one community willing to speak out, and one moment that changes everything.